Deb, did you want to say anything just by way of brief introduction before we got into the presentation?
Well, since I have the opportunity and seldom turn that down, one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is the vast changes in the whole sales process. And even though people have been writing about it and talking about it for years now, I haven't been able to formulate in my own mind where I see the biggest changes. Lately, though, I have agreed with those folks that have put the marker or the line in the sand kind of when using the internet in business became more ubiquitous. And pre-internet, all of us salespeople were pretty much walking websites. And when we had our buyer's hat on, the only way we could really get good information was to talk to a salesperson. And yes, sometimes they handed us the collateral materials and all of that, but really to get the kind of information that we needed, we had to talk to a salesperson. That has certainly changed. When any of us as buyers want to get information generally about a company, the first thing we do is Google or go to their website. And then of course we ask others if they know anything about company X. So the role of salespeople has changed tremendously. And the reason that buyers want to meet with salespeople has changed. And I think those roles and what that means for all of us as sellers and sometimes buyers is really gets to the heart of what we're going to be talking about today on getting that connection started and being able to establish those first-time appointments. So I'll be very interested to hear your discussion and listen to what y'all have to say in the breakout rooms, but let's get started, Sam.
Great. Thanks, Deborah. Just thank you again and welcome to April Business-Wise Insiders. As usual, I'm going to ask people to stay on mute for the duration of the presentation, just so I can get through it quickly and we can move into the breakout sessions. It's a short presentation, probably only about 20 minutes, but then after that, as usual, we'll split into our breakout rooms. You'll have a chance to introduce yourself, ask questions, and share your own perspective with some of our wise guys as well as our other attendees. And you can always ask questions in the chat window during the presentation, and if we can't address it in real time, we can queue it up for discussion in the breakout rooms. And this month's topic, and Deb just alluded to it, is something that we've touched on fairly frequently in previous insider sessions, but it's such an important concept when it comes to B2B prospecting, and we wanted to drill down a little bit further and sort of combine some different angles from previous presentations into one. And the topic is how to sell that first appointment with a new prospect, even if they may never buy from you. And one point of clarification before we start, for the purposes of this discussion, we're talking about trying to set appointments with targeted prospects. And exactly what targeted means will depend on your industry, your business model, and your general approach to business development. For some of you, targeted prospects may be only those ones who are actively looking to solve or have budgeted for a particular problem. And for others, it may be a prospect at a much earlier stage of the buying cycle where they may not even be consciously aware that they have a problem that needs solving. And we'll come back to that idea at the end of the presentation, but just keep it in mind as we move through the presentation. So you might be asking yourself, isn't the point of sales to sell your product or service? And yes, but it's obviously not quite so simple. First, when we say sales, we don't literally mean just selling something. We mean the entire process of new business development, which entails building as many relationships at the opening of your funnel as possible in order to maximize the number of deals you ultimately close. And that means first-time appointments with prospects who may never buy from you. And that's a really critical point. because to look at it another way, we all want that big yes from our prospect, the one where they agree to sign on the dotted line and become a client. But there are many more micro yeses, as we would call them, that lead up to that point that are also critical. So in addition to will you buy my product, you have will you open my email, will you read or respond to it, will you take my call, will you have a conversation, and will you meet with me? And there are even more in between that meeting and the final sale. And without,
Dan,
sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're seeing you and not the presentation, are we?
We're seeing the presentation too.
Yeah, okay, I see it
Yeah.
now. My goof.
Okay, sorry about that. And the point here is that without these earlier micro yeses, a prospect may not ever enter your funnel in the first place, let alone come close to agreeing to become a client. And of course, the flip side of a yes is a no, and sales reps should all be familiar with the different forms no can take. And typically when we think of common prospect objections, we think of these four categories. You have not interested, status quo, which is I don't have a problem, I'm happy with the way they are. A bad experience, I've tried something similar before and it was terrible. Bad timing, we have a lot going on, our budget is spread thin. Or more information, which is sort of a deflection, send me some info and I'll get back to you. But here's the thing, it's very likely that your prospect isn't even close to thinking about buying when you reach them via that cold call or cold email. So of course, they're going to default to one of those common objections. And this is a major reason why you should focus on selling the appointment rather than selling your product or service. And that's because when you try to sell your product to a brand new prospect, you make your job harder than it has to be. And there's three main reasons why that's true. The first is you're turning a small decision about meeting with you into a big one that's about a big, complicated buying decision. So you make a small decision bigger by forcing your prospect to think about that decision just to justify a meeting. The second is that you give them a reason to say no by allowing them to use one of those common objections. I'm happy, I don't have the budget, or one of the others. And then finally, you're immediately putting yourself on a different level than your prospect because you're talking about your product or service and they're not even remotely thinking about the possibility of buying anything. And just a few quick points before we dive into the substance here that you should keep in mind to summarize all this. The first is that we all know you're not going to close a complex sale on a cold call or an email. So the idea here is to start small by making your prospect's decision simple and low risk, and then to think of it as a ladder where you're always aiming for the next step rather than the final step. You can't climb a ladder by jumping from the first rung to the top. You need to move from one to the next, and that's the way your prospect is thinking as well. Deborah, did you want to add anything?
I always like to remind people to think about the funnel as and invert it when you think about this process. So if you think about the sales funnel more as an inverted one or a mountain, that your prospects are having to climb up this steep mountain before they come into that small hole of opportunity. And each of these questions, each of these steps, you have the chance of helping your prospect move up or slide back down. And that's the process that we're really focused on here.
Right. Thanks, Deb. So first, before we get into some of the strategies for selling the appointment, I wanted to talk about psychology, because selling your appointment isn't just a good business development strategy. It actually harnesses the power of psychology in a way that increases the odds of prospect engagement. And we've talked about this before, but you may have heard about Dr. Robert Cialdini's book, Influence the Psychology of Persuasion. Dr. Cialdini is a marketing and psychology professor. His book is based on the premise that people use these mental shortcuts to help them make decisions faster. He identified 6 principles of persuasion, which you can see here on the slide, laying out specific triggers that activate those mental shortcuts. And each of these principles is at work in nearly every aspect of successful business development, but 2 in particular really show the power of selling your prospect and the value of an appointment. And the first is reciprocity, and that's the idea that people feel obligated to give back to others what they've received. So the example here, The woman on the left offers to pay for lunch, and the gentleman on the right feels like he should return the favor. And then the second is commitment and consistency. And that's the idea that people like to be consistent with the things they've previously said or done. So here on the left, the man asks for two things. Will you sign my petition? And the woman on the right agrees, and then follows up with, will you give money to my cause? And since she's already expressed her support on the petition, she feels obligated to follow through. And the idea here, as far as how it relates to setting an appointment, is that reciprocity is at work whenever you offer something of value for free and with no strings attached. So not only is that kind of offer harder to resist because your prospect stands to benefit without having to invest anything but time, it increases the likelihood that she'll say yes when you do ask her for something down the road. So that really distills the idea of making that appointment about offering value with no strings attached. And then the second, maybe even more important in this context, is the idea that commitment and consistency is at work because you're asking for something small first, a short meeting or a conversation with no strings attached, where you give something of value, which paves the way for you to ask for something bigger later. And as we just discussed, when sales reps link the meeting with the idea of buying a product or service, they're actually flipping this idea on its head because you're asking for the big thing before you ask for the small thing, and it makes it harder on the sales rep. And then you give the prospects the opportunity to make those big objections to a small request. Deb, did you want to add anything before I moved on?
Not now. Thanks, Sam.
Great. So let's start looking at how this actually works in practice. And the first step is to make a plan for how exactly you're going to ask for and sell the appointment. And we have a couple of tactics that we use that we wanted to share with you. First is one of our go-to cold call scripts, which we use after a prospect has answered the phone and agreed to spend a few minutes talking with us. And we call it TRICK, which is an acronym for the reason I'm calling. And the idea behind TRICK is sort of twofold. First, it just is a mnemonic device that helps you remember to be direct and get to the point. And second, it reminds you that your call has to have a purpose that both you and your prospect are clear on, and that more importantly, your prospect stands to benefit from. So you can see in the three examples here that we use our purpose always to be about defining that next goal, a meeting where we're providing value to our prospect with no strings attached. And it works the same way with email, and we're big believers in getting to the point. I'm actually interested in the breakout rooms. I think we should discuss this a little more, the idea of asking for a meeting up front versus waiting toward the end of your email or cold call, where you've built rapport and maybe built a case for why you should ask for it. I think there are differing views on that. We're, like I said, believers in getting to the point and asking up front. And we found that emails get a lot more responses when you tell your prospects what you want within those first 2 or 3 sentences. Part of that's because your prospects will move quickly from sort of info gathering mode, where they're trying to figure out what you're writing about, to action mode, where they're responding to a specific request. So we've used these phrases: I'm writing to ask you, I'd like to connect about, you have 15 minutes for. And then beyond asking for the appointment, the whole point here is obviously to sell your prospect on the benefits of that meeting. And here are some general frameworks that we found to be successful. You'll learn about recent trends in industry that firms are using to achieve goal. You'll walk away with top 3 questions you and your team should be thinking about. You'll gain resources we provide to our clients to help them achieve goal. So now that we understand the idea and how to ask for it, we need to ask, what is your value proposition? We've covered this in a previous Insider's presentation, but the basic idea here is your value proposition is how you communicate your unique value to your prospects. And it articulates to your prospects why they should do business with you. But there's one phrase on this slide that needs to be edited for the purposes of today's topic, and that's the words "to do business," because your value proposition isn't only about why prospects should buy from you. Some of you may have heard of Flint McLaughlin and Mech Labs, but if you haven't, they're an organization that performs in-depth research into marketing science. And several years ago, Dr. McLaughlin came up with what he called the value proposition question. It's another way of sort of distilling what it is you offer to your clients or your prospects that give them a reason to engage with you. And it goes, if I am your ideal prospect, why should I say yes to you? There's the idea of yeses again, rather than to your competitors. And of course, you should have an umbrella value proposition. That's the one at the top here that encompasses your essential answer to the question of why should prospects do business with you rather than your competitors. And that's the one that gets you to that big yes I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. It's your guidepost for the top line goals that you help customers achieve. And you should always keep that one in mind. But underneath the umbrella, all those other yeses require their own value propositions. So a value proposition for why a prospect should open your email, why they should call, click, or reply, why they should share their problems and priorities with you. And then for the purpose of this presentation, why should prospects agree to meet with you? And just for one more way to think about this, your value proposition is a force that propels your prospect up and down your sales funnel, or as Deborah mentioned, sort of that inverted sales funnel where there's a mountain. A good value proposition propels them toward the top, from that initial email or phone call to an appointment to a sale. A weak one might cause them to fall back down. And at every stage, that perceived value must outweigh the perceived cost. Ed, did you want to comment here?
This is hard to do. And it's hard enough to create the right value proposition for us, or that umbrella value proposition that Sam was referring to. But now we're charged with coming up with even more value propositions for all of these micro decisions. At the same time, if we don't do it, we're risking a lot of lost opportunities. So I can't urge you enough to take the time to consider all of these small micro decisions and put yourself in the prospect's point of view, which is, if they were that interested in your products or services, they'd be calling you, but they're not. You're reaching out to them. So you have a lot of work to do.
Thanks, Deb. And so I'm just going to quickly wrap up the presentation here, but I wanted to leave you with a few questions that should help get you thinking about how to define your unique value when it comes to setting an appointment, which I know we'll talk more about in the breakout rooms. So first, there's the question of who. Who do you want to meet with? And that gets back to that question I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation about targeted prospects and what that means for you. You know, prospects in a narrow sliver of the buying cycle, the ones that are actively considering solving a problem, maybe that's only the group of prospects you want to meet with, or do you want to meet with prospects at all stages of the cycle? Because that will help figure out what the value of the meeting is to that specific prospect. And then what problems, general or specific, to those prospects have. And you should have a good idea by now, because you've interacted with different categories of clients and different categories of prospects, and you have an idea of what problems you generally help solve. And that's a key point, that these are problems that you can help solve. You are unique position to provide value to help solve. And then just one quick sort of added point here is that once you know who it is, you're going to want to align your value proposition to where that prospect is in the buying cycle. It's something we discussed yesterday as we were preparing for this, is there are sort of different stages of that. There's early stage dissonance, where a prospect has a general sense that something isn't quite working, that the world has changed around him or her, and how do they adapt. There's a stage where they have an idea for the future. They know there's a future that they have to prepare for, and they're thinking about the price of not changing to adapt to that future and what that future state might be. Then they're in sort of a choosing mode, where they're actively considering different options and the trade-offs involved with each. And then obviously the decision, where they might be ready to decide, but inevitably faced with last-minute concerns and needs assurances that those risks are worth the upside. So figuring out where they are can help you define the different problems they might face and the value that you could offer. And then we move from the who to the what, which is, what are you going to provide to your prospect in terms of value that would cause them to want to meet with you, even if they never become a client. And some just questions to get your motor running. Do you have any information or trends or ideas that you might share with a prospect who's not interested in hiring a service like yours or switching vendors now? And one sort of sub question to that is, what has changed in your industry over the past year and a half that a prospect who has the same old vendor may not know about or may not be thinking about? Are there any resources that you offer your current clients that you could also provide to prospects? And then just thinking about how you would answer the question if your prospect asked, why should I meet with you if I'm totally happy with my current vendor? Coming up with the answer to that question can potentially unlock conversations that down the road lead to engagements and appointments. And with that, I'm gonna stop sharing and we'll break into breakout sessions in just a second. We're gonna have a few of our own biz dev experts from Atlanta, Dallas, and Charlotte in each room to help lead the discussion and answer questions. And you should be able to unmute yourselves as soon as you're in the breakout rooms, but if you could just wait a second and let the wise guys introduce themselves to start the discussion, that would be great. And thanks to everybody, and we'll see you in the breakout rooms.